There are moments in every family that no photograph ever captures. Moments that happen behind closed doors, away from the carefully managed smiles and coordinated outfits that the world sees pressed onto the front pages of glossy magazines. The British royal family understands this better than most. They have spent centuries constructing an image of unity, grace, and composure. But even within the most disciplined institution on earth, human emotions have a way of breaking through. And when those emotions involve a mother watching her child being hurt, no amount of protocol in the world is enough to keep the peace. Princess Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has always been regarded as one of the most composed figures in modern royal history. She arrived into the royal family as a young woman and was almost immediately put through a pressure that few people could truly understand. The scrutiny, the expectations, the quiet judgment of those who had been born into a world she was still learning to navigate. She handled it with remarkable steadiness. She studied the institution, respected its rhythms, and found her footing without losing herself in the process. But beneath that poise was always something fierce. A quiet, uncompromising ferocity that she reserved for the things that truly mattered. And nothing mattered more to Catherine than her children. Princess Charlotte, her second child and only daughter, has always been a spirited girl. From a very young age she showed a confidence that was both charming and slightly astonishing. She had her mother's warmth and her father's directness, and she wore both with the ease of someone who had no reason yet to doubt herself. She spoke her mind at family gatherings, engaged adults in conversation without hesitation, played piano with a genuine love for music, and moved through royal events with a naturalness that even seasoned observers found refreshing. She was, in the most simple and important sense, entirely herself. Which is why what began happening during a series of private family gatherings struck Catherine so deeply. It wasn't dramatic at first. It never is, with these things. It began with small moments, the kind that could be explained away if you only saw one of them. A comment that landed with just a little too much weight. A look that lingered a second too long. A suggestion, phrased like advice but delivered like criticism. Alone, each instance might have seemed like nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that Catherine could no longer pretend she wasn't seeing. It was Queen Camilla at the center of it. The relationship between Catherine and Camilla had always required a certain careful management. They were two women bound together by the same institution but shaped by entirely different experiences of it. Camilla had come into the royal family through fire, enduring years of public hostility before eventually finding a place of acceptance. Catherine had arrived with the world seemingly on her side, only to discover that popularity offered no real protection from the pressures that came with the role. They had reached a kind of cordial understanding over the years. Not warmth, exactly, but a functional civility. Catherine had accepted that the relationship would never be close. What she had not accepted, and what she had never imagined she would need to think about, was the idea that Camilla's behavior might begin to affect Charlotte. The first incident that truly registered happened during a family gathering at Windsor. It was a private afternoon event, the kind the royal family hosts periodically to maintain relationships within its extended circle. The children had been seated together in a side room, and Charlotte had been engaged in easy, cheerful conversation with some of her younger cousins. She was animated, eager, and completely herself. When the moment came for the children to join the adults, Charlotte had said something enthusiastic and quick, the way children do when they're excited and unguarded. Camilla's response was quiet but unmistakably pointed. Something to the effect that Charlotte was speaking out of turn. That children ought to listen more and talk less. It was phrased with a light tone, almost casual, but the message underneath was sharp and cold. Charlotte went quiet after that. Not in the way children go quiet when they are bored or distracted. In the way they go quiet when something has reached them that they don't yet have the vocabulary to process. Catherine didn't witness it directly, but she noticed the change in her daughter's face when Charlotte returned to the main gathering. Something had closed down. Something that had been open and easy before was now carefully contained. Later that same afternoon, Catherine found Charlotte standing apart from the group, hands folded in front of her, staring at the middle distance with the expression of a child trying very hard to behave in a way she had been told was correct but didn't understand why. Catherine crouched beside her and asked gently what had happened. Charlotte was initially reluctant to say. She had clearly absorbed the message that she shouldn't speak out of turn, and the irony of that, the fact that the correction itself had silenced her, was something Catherine felt settle in her chest like a stone. Eventually Charlotte said that Granny Camilla had told her she was showing off, that she should let others talk, that a well-behaved girl didn't try to draw attention to herself. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she pulled her daughter close, held her for a moment, and said the things a mother says when a child has been made to feel that simply being themselves is somehow wrong. But inside, something had shifted permanently. In the days that followed, Catherine began to pay closer attention. She realized, with a particular clarity that comes from watching something with new eyes, that this had been happening for longer than she had noticed. Small moments she had previously dismissed as generational difference or personality clash now rearranged themselves into something more deliberate. Camilla had a way of speaking to Charlotte that she did not use with the boys. A slight edge of correction that appeared whenever Charlotte was talkative, enthusiastic, or simply visible in the way children naturally are. The comments were rarely dramatic enough to call out in the moment without seeming oversensitive. That, Catherine came to understand, was precisely the point. There was an afternoon at a countryside estate when Charlotte had reached eagerly for a second helping at tea, and Camilla had smiled in that particular way, the smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and suggested that perhaps Charlotte should show a little more restraint. There was the evening in one of the formal sitting rooms when Charlotte had asked politely to play the piano, something she genuinely loved and was genuinely good at, and Camilla had waved the request away with a comment about letting the adults have some quiet. Each remark, delivered with just enough plausible lightness to seem casual. Each one landing precisely on Charlotte's confidence. Catherine did not confront her immediately. That was never her way. She observed, she considered, and she spoke first with William. She told him everything she had seen, not as a list of grievances but as a clear and steady account of what was happening to their daughter. William listened. He asked no defensive questions and offered no explanations for Camilla's behavior. He simply agreed that it needed to stop. But he also knew, as Catherine did, that the way they handled it would matter. A public confrontation would become a story. A careless word in the wrong ear would travel. Whatever they did, it had to be deliberate. The moment that changed things came during a private family dinner at Highgrove. The evening had been arranged as a relaxed gathering, an attempt at informal togetherness that Charles was particularly fond of organizing. Charlotte had been allowed to come down briefly to say good night before being taken upstairs by her nanny. She entered the room the way she always did, with a small smile and a polite greeting for everyone present. She went to Camilla first, as was expected, and said good evening. Camilla's response was a cool glance and a remark, delivered to the room as much as to the child, wondering aloud whether Charlotte wasn't perhaps looking a little tired and might be better off upstairs. It was a small thing. And it was not a small thing at all. Catherine guided Charlotte out of the room calmly, instructed the nanny to take her upstairs, and waited until the door closed. Then she turned back to the room. There was no raised voice. There was no dramatic gesture. There was simply Catherine, standing very still, with a particular quality of stillness that people who know her well recognize as the moment before something important is said. She looked at Camilla directly. And she spoke. She said that she had been watching for some time, that she had given the benefit of the doubt, again and again, to remarks and looks and corrections that she had hoped were thoughtless rather than intentional, but that she could no longer extend that benefit of the doubt, because the pattern was too clear and the effect on Charlotte was too real. She said that her daughter was not a child with behavioral problems. She was not too loud, or too eager, or too much of anything. She was a little girl who deserved to feel welcomed and valued in the presence of her own family, and that if the current dynamic continued, Catherine would make decisions about Charlotte's presence at family events that she would prefer not to have to make. The room was very quiet. Charles made one attempt to soften the moment, to suggest that everyone was tired and perhaps this could be discussed another time. Catherine said, with complete composure, that it was being discussed now. Camilla did not apologize. She tried briefly to reframe her behavior as concern, as experience, as the natural authority of an elder offering guidance to a younger generation. Catherine did not argue with the framing. She simply said that whatever the intention, the impact on her daughter was what mattered, and that impact was not acceptable. William, who had remained silent through the early part of the exchange, spoke then. He said that he and Catherine were in complete agreement, that they were not asking for anything extraordinary. They were asking for basic kindness to be extended to their child. He said it quietly, but in the royal family, A quiet statement from the Prince of Wales carries enormous weight. Camilla looked at Charles. Charles looked at the table. Catherine left the room shortly after, went upstairs, and sat with Charlotte until her daughter fell asleep. She didn't talk about what had happened downstairs. She talked about Charlotte's piano pieces, about the horse she had been learning to ride, about a book they were reading together. She kept her voice steady and her presence warm. Whatever Charlotte needed to feel that night, Catherine was going to make sure she felt it. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but in the ways that matter inside a family. Charlotte was not brought to certain events. The palace communications team handled the explanations, citing scheduling and health considerations. But within the household, the message was understood. Catherine had drawn a boundary, and she was enforcing it with a quiet, implacable consistency that made people who underestimated her eventually realize their mistake. Camilla adjusted. She kept her distance from Charlotte at shared events. The comments stopped. The looks stopped. Whether this reflected genuine reflection or simply the calculation that Catherine was no longer someone who could be pushed, it didn't matter. The result was what Catherine had asked for. Her daughter began to relax again. The Charlotte who ran into rooms without thinking about how much space she was taking up, who played piano at full enthusiasm, who asked questions without watching first to see whether she was allowed to speak, that Charlotte came back. And Catherine watched it happen with the particular relief of a mother who had been afraid she might be too late. The dynamic within the wider royal family quietly recalibrated. Charles, who loved both women and had no desire to be positioned between them, treated the matter as closed. Those within the household who had observed everything said nothing publicly, but the shift in how people moved around each other at family gatherings told its own story. Catherine was no longer managing her relationship with Camilla. She had stopped trying to preserve something that had never really worked. She was simply making sure her children were safe within their own family. That was the only goal she was working toward now. What this episode ultimately revealed was something that people who follow the royal family from the outside often sense but cannot easily articulate. Catherine's composure has always been real. It is not a performance. But it has limits. And those limits are not about her own comfort, or her status, or even her marriage. They are about her children. The institution matters to her. The role matters to her. But neither of those things matters more than George, Charlotte, and Louis feeling that they are loved and safe and whole. The moment those things came into conflict, there was never really any question about which Catherine would choose. She did not go to war. She did not seek destruction. She simply told the truth, held her line, and refused to move from it. In a family built on centuries of putting the institution above the individual, that kind of quiet personal courage is rarer and more powerful than it looks from the outside. Charlotte would grow up knowing that her mother had seen what was happening and had not looked away. She would grow up knowing that her voice was worth protecting. And in a world that has very specific ideas about how royal girls are supposed to be, quiet and poised and always appropriate, that knowledge might turn out to be the most important thing Catherine ever gave her.